Cold-hearted orb that rules the night, removes the colors from our sight. Red is gray and yellow white, but we decide which is right and which is an illusion. Hello, my name is Virgil, and today I'd like to talk about Ramsey Cambell and his book, The Hungry Moon. I also want to talk about maybe a couple of other stories that Ramsey Cambell has written and kind of how I discovered him, and another story that I think kind of is an interesting sort of mirror to this story, The Hungry Moon. So if you don't know who Ramsey Cambell is, he's a British horror writer that got his start in the late 70s, I believe, and primarily wrote in the 80s, although he's continued to write on and on and on since then. He's kind of known for his sort of Lovecraftian sort of take on horror. He sort of follows a Lovecraftian tradition in a sense, but with his own spin on it. I'm kind of a fan of Ramsey Cambell, and it's not a writer that we see talked about a lot outside of maybe people who read other horror novels and books. He's just not a writer that you maybe, not like a big name in stars type writer that you hear about. You know, he's not like somebody like King or Kuntz or something like that. I think he should be more recognized than he is, but I think maybe the reason that we don't see or hear as much about him is because his style of writing. And I think that his particular style, which is sort of slightly surrealistic and sort of dreamlike, maybe isn't as sort of like bold-faced and stark terror type stuff that we get with Stephen King, or the sort of, I don't know how to say it, like sort of like all-American horror that Dean Koontz writes. Is that a weird way to say that? That's how I think of Dean Koontz. The Hungry Moon was published in 1986. It features the small English town of Moonwell that has this natural forming cave sort of in a depression. At one point somebody thought that the well was deep enough that it could swallow the moon. That's kind of where it gets its name from. At least that's what we're told when the story starts. The small village has a tradition of decorating the cave that goes back to druidic times. It's not, the town itself is maybe not very easy to find. It's not really on the map, or maybe it's not marked properly on the map. We're told very early on that Moonwell is in the darkest part of England, and that there's it seems to be there's very little sun in Moonwell. It gets the least amount of sun than anywhere else in England. Sort of an interesting little foreshadowing that we get right there at the beginning. Now, Hungry Moon starts sort of introducing us to this town and sort of set away, and this rather large cast of characters. I would say there's about 12 or 13 characters that we bounce around through. I'm like, I don't remember which character this is. It's just the nature of me, I suppose. So, you know, it's a larger cast. And the novel goes on. I think you get more and more familiar and you're able to associate, but it takes a little bit at first because they're introduced all right at the beginning. All these characters are introduced right at the beginning of the story. After the characters in the town of Moonwell are introduced, a religious leader, Godwin Man, shows up with his congregation. He gives a speech in the moors on the edge of town where the Moonwell is, that the town gets its name from. In that speech, he basically says that he had a very troubled youth and almost committed suicide based on his father and the sort of corruption of Hollywood. And so after this suicide attempt in the hospital, he finds God and realizes that he has to push all this other stuff, this Hollywood nonsense, away, all this corruption, and it became his mission to come here to stop the annual decorating of the cave, the well, that happens every year. That's part of a druidic tradition. Godwin Man and his followers stay in town after he makes his speech, sort of imploring the people of the town to not give in to the devil or Satan, and to practice these pagan rituals that are an offense against God, like ultimatum type approach towards everyone else in town that basically wins everyone over to their side. This sort of like, well, you wouldn't want to do that, and like, would you really risk your immortal soul and risk alienating God just to decorate this cave? And that's sort of like the approach that they have, not just to that, but to like everything. And like all the people that move in, and really, when I say congregation, it's actually not, that's how it's presented, but it's not what these people are. It's not what the followers of God Man are. They're really much more of a cult, and it really feels like a cult. Although they, well, we'll leave it at that. So they're almost like cult-like in how they sort of guilt everyone and sort of this sort of like, you know, put these extremely high stakes on top of everything, except for the main characters. And it's also interesting to note, or important to note, that all the main characters in the story are either like not residents of the town of Moonwell, or had lived outside the town of Moonwell and moved back, or are currently living in the town of Moonwell for one reason or another. The first, I'd say, third or half of the book is this sort of very antagonistic sort of preaching that Godwin man gives. He's, he speaks all and talks in such a way that's very convincing, but you can also sort of like get this impression that it's very much, there's only one true way, and it's the way that I'm presenting to you. It's very cultish, and that's the tension in the first part of the novel. And I really actually thought that's what this novel was. I thought it was going to be a cult novel, a novel about this cult moving into this town. But then somewhere around the third to halfway mark, the supernatural element took over. I said earlier that he has a like dreamlike or sort of surrealistic quality to his writing. And that's when this supernatural element shows up in The Hungry Moon. That's what it's like. It's this very sort of, kind of intangible offness. The style, the approach that The Hungry Moon takes, in fact, the story, the entire breadth of the story, reminds me very much of Silent Hill. I mean, it really does. Whether you like the original Silent Hill movie, some people didn't like it, some people think it's a bad movie. I think actually I like it quite a lot. I think it's actually very faithful to the game, and I like that sort of like alienation and sort of isolation that you get in that type of horror. But this story has a very Silent Hill-ish approach, and I kind of wonder if the original creators had read. I mean, I think that it's very likely that they had read Ramsey Cambell. Ramsey Cambell, like I said, has a very Lovecraftian sort of angle. He's sort of seen as maybe, I don't want to say a descendant in that sense. He's not. He doesn't write Lovecraftian pastiches or anything. He writes stuff in his own style, but it has that sort of unnatural element, or that unknowable, undefinable sort of horror. It's not like a monster that just walks out of the dark and strangles you or something like that. It's this sort of dread and this sort of pervading horror, and sort of like something you can't exactly define. You don't really know how to defend yourself against this sort of stuff. The things that Campbell puts his protagonist through are things that you can't necessarily just shoot or burn or just run away from. As the story progresses and the supernatural element becomes more and more strong, as it develops and this sort of moves away from this sort of like what I would think of as maybe more of a suspense novel or a thriller of this cult moving into town. You can already see when the cult moves in that there's going to be conflict, that the main characters who don't buy into Godwin man's sort of spiel, that there's going to be a confrontation between them and the townsfolk. And of course there is. I don't think that's a surprise. You can already feel that. And I really thought that that's what he was going to do with this, that's what this story was going to be. But it's all that plus a really great sort of creepy supernatural story about this small New England town that has this sort of like hidden secret, this sort of ugly thing from the past, I guess you'd say. I don't want to talk about the supernatural element too much, other than to say that it definitely gets dreamlike and surreal, and the characters in the story, when they encounter this stuff, don't really know the rules, and there's really not even clear lines like, oh, this person is going to have something bad happen to them because they're a bad person. Well, that doesn't necessarily hold true. I would definitely say that there's not really any safe characters at all in this story. I mean, that's kind of, maybe you don't like that kind of story, but I mean, I was kind of surprised that like, oh, I thought these characters were safe. No, that's not true. They're not safe, which I appreciate. It's not that Campbell seems to beat up unnecessarily on his protagonist, but I guess that they're dealing with something that isn't so moralistically motivated. If you like Lovecraftian horror, then you'll probably like Campbell. I would be kind of surprised if you hadn't already heard of Ramsey Cambell. And if you like that sort of strange quality, that sort of otherworldliness, and that sort of like entering like a dream world almost, or maybe like another reality, that like a dark version of our own reality, that sort of thing, that sort of like this sort of blending of that, sort of blurring of that line. That's kind of a quality of like Silent Hill, for example, if you like that game, or if you like horror that's like that, or movies that are like that, then I think that The Hunger Moon might be a really good fit for you. Campbell's pacing is a little bit slower. It's not a shocker type horror at all either. There's not blood splashes across the wall and maniacs running around with a knife. It's more of a like, what is that? You know, I guess you could say it's more like Algernon Blackwood, right? What's that really famous story, The Willows by Algernon Blackwood? It's more like that. That story is a lot more about like, what am I seeing? What am I encountering? And it just sort of this dread that builds up in you. And that's kind of what Campbell's doing here. It's a little bit more stark than that. It's a little bit more real than just sort of like, I don't know what this thing is. I mean, there's definitely some interaction, and definitely people don't make it. Early in the book, it's set up that like Goblin Man and his cult, even though they're Christian, so to speak, that they're maybe not really very Christian, or that like their methods aren't Christian. That the sort of like bullying and sort of ultimatum style of crusading that they're doing is not really very fair. That they're sort of like coming into the small town and sort of taking over. And you don't really like them for that. But then you're also not certain at a point in the novel if maybe the main characters are on the right side or not. You're like, maybe they should be with these people, or maybe they shouldn't, but it's like you feel like they're just by themselves, you know? They feel isolated and alienated from the town that they live in. Also, the supernatural elements are not cliche. They don't follow the sort of normal like tentacled Lovecraftian horrors, or like, you know, fanged, blood dripping monsters or anything like that. It's all stuff that's just really weird, and you just don't know what it is you're seeing or looking at, and you don't know what to think about it. And the main characters are often even conflicted about these supernatural things that they encounter. A really good curl up sort of fall, you know, kind of creepy horror read. Like I said, doesn't focus heavily on like really scaring you. It's much more focused on that sense of alienation and dread and being alone. You know, I mean, one of Campbell's short story collections is called Alone with the Horrors, and that's a very good way to sum up the kind of things that Campbell writes, the kind of style that he has. Now, I first discovered Ramsey Cambell when I read Stephen King's Danse Macabre, and I got that right. Thank you. In there, he talks about, and this book was published, and I didn't get right because I didn't have this ready. Was this originally copywritten? This was written a long time ago. No, that's not true, was it? He wasn't even alive then. It was originally published in 1981. In there, Ramsey Cambell was a newer writer, and King was praising his first book, at least I believe it's his first book, The Doll Who Ate Its Mother. And that's the book that I bought and read. Now, I'm not going to review this book here because it's been a long time since I've read it. I guess I need to read it again. But a really good, King praised this book and the next book of Ramsey Campbell's The Parasite, which I used to have it. I don't think I have anymore. What a shame. It just goes to show you never sell the books you think, oh, I'm never going to read that again. You're wrong. You probably will, especially if you like books. You're going to read it again. Don't get rid of it. It'll be harder to find and it'll cost you more money. Just buy a house and store all your books there. It's not good advice. But I read those books for Ramsey Campbell, really enjoyed them. So that's how I discovered Ramsey Cambell. When I was reading The Hunger Moon, I was thinking with this cult aspect of Goblin Man, I was thinking about this other story that I'd read that was not a Ramsey Cambell story. And it was from the Book of Cthulhu. And that's a short story collection of sort of Cthulhu and Lovecraftian themed stories that came out in 2011. I'd highly recommend this book. This is like a micro review of that book, I guess you'd say. But I was specifically thinking of a David Drake story. David Drake's story, and that is called They Curse the Darkness. That story is about a cult that worships Nyarlathotep. I'm assuming that you kind of know a little bit about Lovecraftian horror. Nyarlathotep was like one of the outer gods, that part of the Cthulhu-esque mythos, although Cthulhu and Nyarlathotep are not in the same pantheon, I don't believe. I'm not even sure if they're ever expressly like defined as pantheon. I don't know how much of that I'm getting confused with the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. But David Drake's story, Then Curse the Darkness, is about a cult that worships Nyarlathotep in Africa, and these Europeans and American show up to sort of put down this cult. Very standard fare, and, you know, and as a like a Lovecraftian story, it's very good. But what's really interesting in that story, which I really liked, is that the cult and that worships Nyarlathotep is painted in a light where you're very sympathetic to them, because what David Drake does with that story, then Curse the Darkness, is all these Europeans are horrible, horrible people. They're racist and exploitative and outright murder the Africans that they're taking rubber from, because that's why they're in Africa in the first place. Is it's part of the slavery that existed around the rubber trade. As far as I know, the way it's represented in David Drake's story is pretty accurate. Just atrocities is really the only way to view the stuff that happened. And then those characters, these Europeans and American, commit atrocities. The protagonists are the bad guys. And even one of the characters at the very end of the story says, I never thought of myself. If these guys were evil, I never would have thought that we're the good guys. And they all kind of laugh about that, because they're absolutely not. And one of the characters says, I wonder what would drive these people to worship such a horrible thing that would destroy them and destroy life as we know it on the earth. But you, the reader, when you're reading the story, you're thinking, I could think of about 100 reasons at this moment why I would totally be on the side of Nyarlathotep. You guys are horrible, doing just terrible things, terrible things. A really great, interesting sort of story where the narrative is sort of flipped, so to speak. You know, where we really sympathize with the bad guys as the story is presented. And I think that's Drake's intention, is to sort of show us that, you know, the sort of racist and sort of very exploitative personalities of Europe, and how they're often painted in this sympathetic light, and we're doing a lot of things that were just horrible. I really like that story. I think it's really worth reading. That, in fact, this whole collection is really great. The Book of Cthulhu. That was a David Drake story. David Drake, I think, is mostly known for his fantasy, and also sort of like military sci-fi. I believe David Drake is the Hammer Slammers. I think that was his thing, which is sort of like a futuristic sci-fi, sort of like tank command group. I don't know. I've not read it. I just know of it. But I think he focuses heavily on or much more on military sci-fi. I really recommend that story. I think it's a really interesting complement to this story, you know, where you have this cult, this religious cult that's supposed to be good but is really bad. And here you have a religious cult that's supposed to be bad but is really good in David Drake's story. So I think that's worth it. Ramsey Cambell happens to have a story in there. His is called The Tugging. And if you want to sample Ramsey Cambell and see what his writing is like, that's a really great story. Ramsey Cambell seems to have a slight obsession with the moon, because that story also has a lot of moon imagery in it, just like the Hungry Moon. I think it'll give you a good idea of the sort of very bizarre, dreamlike quality to his writing and his stories. You know, the characters, the main protagonists, often struggle with what is real. Am I hallucinating? Am I going to another place? Is this other place exist? Really enjoy Ramsey Cambell's writing. Really enjoy that style. Reminds me a lot of the Silent Hill stuff, which I'm a big fan of. Try that. I would highly recommend The Hungry Moon by Ramsey Cambell. And if you're not sure, and even if you are sure, I really recommend the Book of Cthulhu. There's some really excellent stories in there. Really a great variety. Some of them are funny. There's a funny gothic story about these two twins. I cannot remember who wrote it, but I'll put the text up here. That was a really good one. So it was like a gothic story, but it's kind of humorous. I really enjoyed that. Some of the stories are kind of graphic. I mean, I think you should expect that if you're reading horror anyways, but I just want to point out that some of the stories are a little graphic. I don't know that there might be one or two that kind of verge on splatterpunk or get close to splatterpunk. I don't know. But a lot of really great writers in there, really great stories. I know Joe R. Lansdale, for example, has another story there. So that's just a couple. Gene Wolfe is a favorite of mine. He's got a story in there. So I would recommend both of those books, and hopefully I didn't talk too long. That is it. I think Ramsey Cambell could be a really good fit for a Halloween or sort of spooky season read that you might want to do. In fact, I think it would be a great book just to read into the weather gets colder to sort of curl up and enjoy. And that curl up phrase that I just said reminds me of Garth Marenghi's Terror Tome, which I reviewed a couple months back. That's another great book. I'm just going to tote it again because it was such a good and enjoyable book. And the reason it's on my mind right now, and also the tagline for the book was great to curl up with this book and die, which I just think is hilarious. But that book has a sequel that's coming out October 31st. Last I checked, you cannot buy it in the US, and I'm not really sure why. There's an Audible book version coming out, and probably a Kindle version, but it's only looks to be UK. I'm going to guess it's going to get a wider release later. I'm not sure. However, I will tell you, because I did it, you can pre-order the book from the UK from, I can't remember the website, but I'll put it up. You can pre-order a signed copy, which is one I did. I think it's a really great opportunity. If you read Terror Tome, oh, this is great. I'm going to try to remember how to pronounce this title of this book. It was Infernatorium? Is that right? Oh, I don't know. Incendi... Whoo! You know what? Give me just a second. Let me see if I can get this for us. I had to look it up. Incarcerat. So it's coming out October 31st, 2023. I loved Terror Tome. I thought it was hilarious and great if you like horror. That's an amazing book. I have only positive thoughts about Incarcerat. So yeah, I'll put some information up. The name of the publisher who was selling signed copies. Buy yourself a signed copy. You pay a little more, but honestly, this is one of those rare times where I'm like, yeah, I'll pay a little more for this, and I think it was very reasonable for a signed copy. I don't know what my shipping is going to be. I'm just going to have to accept it. Fantastic Planet. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate your time. My name is Virgil. This has been Literally Books. If at some point during this you were entertained, it'd be really nice if you wanted to subscribe, but only do it if you plan on watching more of my stuff. Otherwise, it just seems silly for me to ask you to do something that you're not going to do more of. Anyways, thanks. That's it. I read horror books, October, spooky. Bye.